Hi everyone, this is William with the Grand Duke Dmitri Diary series. A nice spring-like day in February 2026, the 5th of February, here in the Portland, Oregon area. Things are really starting to happen in the diaries at the moment. You know, we had the shock of the Bolshevik Revolution, the October Revolution, and then chaos. Nobody knew what was going on, and so we had to wait a bit for the dust to settle, and now things are starting to get organized. So we've got some really interesting content in the diary entries now, and also upcoming, kind of nonstop for a while. And let's see, our recap. We're finishing up today with the last section of the 24th November 1917, and the topic has been possible collaboration between the British and the Russians in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Mesopotamia, because a healthy portion of the Russian army wanted to continue the war. And so the only real option for doing that was to have support from the Allies, because material support, because otherwise they just wouldn't be able to manage it. So that's what we are going to be finishing up with today. So this deputation had been sent to Tehran to start getting things in motion, to get in touch with London, to be working through the Russian and British ministers in Tehran. And Dmitri said that things were settled, that it took 5 days, and then things were settled between Britain and these Russian troops. Well, that's a vast simplification. It would end up happening, as far as they would be working hand in hand, but in a messy way, not in the neat, tidy, rapid way that Dmitri has in mind here. Anyway, let's dive into the new material while I try and adjust this. And here we go. Yes, great events are beginning now that, with God's help, will turn things in a completely different direction. As for Baratov's corps, it's been decided to withdraw it from the front gradually and replace it with national regiments, Georgians and Armenians. I personally had a long conversation with Kharitonov on this topic. He spoke a great deal about politics and blank that apparently he was satisfied. I raised the question about transferring to the Cossacks. He promised to help and said it isn't that hard. I think General Raditz's division is no longer going over to the English, but in any case, I accepted Baratov's proposal to go with them, mainly because apparently it could help me transfer to the Terek host. As far as I understand the general situation in Russia, apparently there is a proposal to completely ignore the capitals, Petrograd and Moscow. They want to take them blank. There is already news that Kaledin is not allowing bread through to the capitals, and if famine begins in Petrograd, then the inhabitants themselves will see that Lenin's government is incompetent and overthrow it. I think a plan of that kind might work, but for me personally, it's not so nice to think that Maria, Papa, and Laming are there. But such personal thoughts I decided long ago to drive out and not give them any place. As for the army, apparently it was nonetheless not as easy to embark on the Leninist peace program as one might have thought. Apparently, only 3 armies have agreed to make peace. Yes! Exclamation point. Now we are standing on the verge of great events and must just pray to the Lord that He will have mercy on poor Russia and help her get on the right path. Now every day can bring unexpected developments. The only thing that bothers me with regard to the actions of the departments of the Caucasus and then the independent actions of Kaledin is the question of unity. It's terribly frightening to think that all the nationalities will act independently without a general plan. It's frightening that though there is initiative to go against Lenin, against the shame of Russia and her separate peace, Nonetheless, utopian ideas of democracy will not recede to the background behind the main task of the resurrection of Russia, her honor and greatness. We will see what happens. Indeed. Okay, that indeed was me rather than Dmitri. All right, a lot to talk about there, a lot. Also interesting. So let's start with the nationalities. So the nationalities question had been something vitally important in Russia ever since the Caucasus had been taken, and Central Asia had been taken, had been incorporated into the Russian Empire. And you can even find, for instance, go back to Anna Karenina, the great Tolstoy masterpiece, and you'll see that Alexei Karenin, Anna's estranged husband, who is very high up in the Russian government, is tasked precisely with going and talking to representatives of the various nationalities and, getting things sorted out, so to speak, as far as making sure that everybody is working together. I have no expertise whatsoever on that question, either in the context of Imperial Russia or Soviet Russia, so I can't really contribute on that, just that it wasn't only an issue now at this particular point. It had been for quite a while. Okay, and you had already, so Dmitri talks about Baratov's corps being withdrawn, and then the regiments specifically of Georgians and Armenians being the ones to take over, pick up the slack from the withdrawal of Baratov's corps. So, again, this was something that was already in place to a certain extent. So, for instance, as you know, the Cossacks had their own units, and also you had, for instance, the Savage Division that Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich, the Tsar's younger brother, was the commander of. And the Savage Division was a mixture of troops from various parts of the Caucasus. So it makes sense that now this idea of cooperating hand in hand with the British would be troops and nationalities from that region, because Dmitri told us before that the number he gave was that 60% of the troops in the units in the Caucasus and Central Asia were Russian, and that the Russian soldiers didn't want to continue the war. They didn't want to continue fighting. So it was going to come down to the other 40% in the Caucasian Corps. Okay, so Dmitri has this personal talk with Kharitonov, who was a general staff colonel and one of the 3 people in the deputation that had been sent by General Przhevalsky, the commander of the Caucasian army. So Dmitri is very much involved in this. The question here, an interesting question that arises, was why did he so much want to transfer to the Terek Cossacks? He wanted to become a Cossack, and he wanted to officer, and he wanted specifically to be a Terek Cossack officer, and he doesn't qualify for that. So this was a northern Caucasian Cossack host. And yeah, I can't answer that question of why he had them in mind in particular, but it's interesting. And another interesting question that arises is why there's this issue of, well, it might be a hard thing to do. It might not be something that he can just do automatically. And as a Romanov, not at this point anyway. So he gets this reassurance from Kharitonov. No, it wouldn't be that hard. It can be arranged, and it would be interesting to know what the ins and outs of that would be, and why he would need people intervening on his behalf in order to arrange that. It never ends up happening, but Anyway, if you want to look at very interesting content around Cossacks and the time of the revolution in the First World War, well, there's some very interesting stuff out there. So the Cossacks were, back at the time of Peter the Great, and the Cossacks had been very iffy and very often in rebellion against the central power of the Russian Empire. But by this point, they were largely conservative. They would be very strongly represented in the Civil War, the Russian Civil War. And you have really interesting portrayals in literature, I think primarily of the Shokholov, I think that's his surname, who wrote And Quiet Flows the Dawn, about the Cossacks, and one particular Cossack in particular. There was a Cossack in Soviet Russia who was kind of a hero, but also was the subject of dirty jokes for some reason. He was a Cossack leader named Chapayev, who fought for the Red Army, and for some reason in Soviet Russia, there were all kinds of dirty jokes around the activities of Chapayev. I don't know why, but I remember when I was a student at the University of Southern California, we had to read this book of Soviet realism style about the Cossack leader Chapayev, fighting for the Bolsheviks, for the Red troops. Anyway, maybe Dmitri thought that the Cossacks were going to be more reliably Tsarist, and maybe they were. I haven't looked that far into that, but yeah, he wanted to join the Terek host. If he had done that, what would have happened? If he had done that, he would have been right at the heart of things in the Civil War. So he would not have been leaving Russia and going to England and being well out of it. He would have been right there at the center of things during the Civil War. So interesting to think about what that might have been like. And here he refers to Baratov's proposal, and I had said in another video, well, I don't remember what happened with that. So if you'll recall, Baratov had written to Dmitri and said, look, here's an opportunity for you. This Radats division, was it a division? A division is going to go to Mesopotamia and fight alongside the British, and they would like you to join up as an officer translator. You wouldn't have to command anything. Dmitri did not want to command anything, but you'd go as a translator. And Dmitri wanted to do that. But as it turns out, General Radats' division did not end up following through with that. Hence, Dmitri did not end up going, and he tells us that the main reason he had wanted to go was so that he could transfer to the Terek Cossacks, who I guess were part of Radats' division. Anyway, what are we up to? So we turn to European Russia then, and this idea that Kaledin, who was the ataman of the Don Cossack host, so we're talking about Ukraine. Kaledin there was this story in circulation that Kaledin was blocking the roads from Ukraine to Petrograd and Moscow so that wheat couldn't get through. And the idea being to starve out the two capitals, and the strategy behind that, which I think is really a stupid one, is that when they're starving, the residents of Petrograd and Moscow are going to rebel. They're going to blame the Bolshevik government, and they're going to attack the Bolshevik government. Well, personally, I think it would have been the opposite. I think it would have driven them right into the hands of the Bolsheviks, and they would have said, well, look, the White Russians are trying to starve us. That wouldn't, I don't know, I could be wrong. I'm not a military or political strategist. Duke, got me here. All right. Well, we'll see if I'm going to be able to finish up with this. Anyway, Dmitri thinks it might work. There must be someone out there with a dog. Okay, so Dmitri thinks it might work. The problem for him is that his family, well, not Maria, because she'd gone to the Caucasus, but his family were in Petrograd. But, the most interesting thing about all of this from the standpoint of the diaries is what Dmitri says about that such personal thoughts I decided long ago to drive out and not to give them any place. And he was indeed consistent about that. So whenever it came to a choice between doing something to help his loved ones or prioritizing Russia, he was going to prioritize Russia, he's telling us. And that I mentioned before, this anecdote, well, it comes directly from his diary, where his aunt in London, Grand Duchess Maria Georgievna, asked him to join her in contacting President Wilson to try to intervene and save the 4 Grand Dukes who were being held by the Bolsheviks and would indeed end up being shot. And Dmitri said, no, I'm not going to participate in that. I'm not going to sign the letter because I don't want to give the impression that all the Romanovs care about is saving their own skin. So, you know, you could argue that that was bad on his part or that was good on his part, but that was his reasoning. And that is exactly what he's saying here. Well, if my loved ones are in the capital and the best strategy is to starve the capital, then so be it. Okay, so where do we go from there? Going down then to the last paragraph, and he's talking 100% like a general staff officer when he says that that Russia's shame would be a separate peace. That's the thing to be avoided at all costs. And that the main task is the resurrection of Russia, specifically in the context of preserving her honor and greatness. So this is the realpolitik. This is the general staff priority. The most important thing, more than the dynasty, more than anything else, is to preserve Russia's place in the world as a great power. That's where her honor and greatness reside, and that's where her shame comes in if she ends up failing in that mission. So very, very interesting content. And what do we have next time? Well, again, really interesting. We have another person crossing the border into Persia, another Russian, and in this instance, he will be bringing Dmitri the very coveted letters from home that Dmitri's been hoping to get for a long time, and finding out what's happening at home in the eyes of his relatives. All right, so I hope to see you then. Bye.